I'm going to begin today's program by discussing some important news that's been coming from the Ukrainian battlefronts. Specifically, late yesterday, confirmation was received of the presence of Russian troops in the central part of the village of Progres in the Ocheretino Avdiivka area, or as increasing numbers of reporters, both on the Russian and Ukrainian side, are now starting to call it the Pokrovsk area. Anyway, reports started to appear that the Russians had reached the center of this village of Progres, and photos, in fact, and film actually appeared, which confirmed the presence of Russian soldiers in the central part of the village of Progres. And late last night, reports also started to circulate that the Russians had, in fact, captured the entirety of Progres, that the Ukrainian troops who were tasked with defending this village essentially fled, and that it was pointed out by various bloggers and reporters, but most specifically by the Military Summary Channel. The pictures, the film that was coming out of Progres showing the Russian soldiers in that village seemed to show them moving around the village without any special fear that they might be attacked by the Ukrainians, and with all the buildings around them intact, suggesting that Progres might have fallen to the Russians with essentially no fighting. Now, I should say that this morning, the Ukrainian mapping project, which I shall refer to by its initials, DS, I think the entire name causes concern to the algorithm, just say. But anyway, the Ukrainian mapping project concedes that the Russians are indeed in control of around half of Progres, but still seems to show the Ukrainians controlling part of the village. Now, just before I started making this program, there were further reports, again from Russian sources, that the village of Novoselivka Pasha, somewhat to the southwest, or southeast of Progres, another bitterly fought over village in this area, has also now passed fully under Russian control. The Ukrainian troops who were trying to defend Ukrainian positions in Novoselivka Pasha supposedly have also fled. Now, whether the Russians control all of Progres or not, I think to some extent is unimportant. The fact is that, again, the Russians have advanced much faster in this area than anybody expected, and it does look as if Progres, if it hasn't fallen already, is about to fall. Now, as I have discussed in various programs previously, Progres is absolutely a part of the larger Pokrovsk conurbation. It is also dangerously close from a Ukrainian point of view to the other important town, supply town of Selidovo, somewhat to the southwest, and it looks as if Progres, if it hasn't yet fallen, is about to fall, and it is likely that with the fall of Progres, the Russians will not only have secured their flanks, enabled them to advance north towards the village of Vozvyzhenka, which they have apparently reached the outskirts of, but actually to storm Vozvyzhenka itself and to cut the main road from Pokrovsk to Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka in the east. But anyway, not only will the Russians have secured their flanks enabling them to carry out this advance towards this road and towards the village of Vozvizenka. But they will now be within, I think, fairly clear artillery range of Pokrovsk itself, and it looks as if it's now becoming, I think, increasingly clear that Pokrovsk is indeed a Russian military objective, that the Russians are working their way towards the eventual capture of Pokrovsk itself, something which, if it happens, will have a decisive, a major impact on the future of the war in the Donbass. So there we are. That's one fairly dramatic piece of news from the battlefronts this morning. Two key villages, Progres and Novoselivka Persha, have fallen. I discussed in recent programs how the Russians appear, well, not appear, apparently it's confirmed, have cut the road leading from the village of Konstantinovka, further south, to the fortified town of Vuhledar in southern Donetsk region, and that they seem to be enlarging their area of control along this road. I have seen that several other commentators have made the same point that I made in my program yesterday, that if the Russians, having cut the road, then decide to advance beyond the road, capturing the village of Vodyane and moving on to the next road beyond Vodyane, leading to Vuhledar, then all the major supply roads to Vuhledar will have been captured by the Russians, at which point the defense of Vuhledar, the long-term defense of Vuhledar, becomes impossible. So, fairly dramatic news, both in the Pokrovsk area, if I can call it that now, but also in the southern Donetsk area. And even as the Russians have made these breakthroughs, we're getting further news that they've made more breakthroughs in the area of Toretsk, one of the most heavily fortified positions, areas along the front lines, which the Ukrainians have been building up the fortifications ever since 2014. And yesterday, I believe it was the Russian Defense Ministry announced that the village of Yurivka, which is in the Toretsk area, has been captured by the Russians. And this morning, there are reports that a major coal mines in this area, by the way, are important fortified positions, very difficult positions to capture, but that an important coal mine in this area of Toretsk has also been captured by the Russians. And again, this has happened much more quickly than might have been anticipated. So the Russians continuing their advance, and not only doing so, but in conditions where the Ukrainians are retreating and giving up fortified positions, heavily fortified and important positions, which earlier in the war one would have expected them to defend. Now, all of this is taking place against a backdrop of protests in Ukraine. They seem to be spreading from town to town. There are reports of protests in Zaporozhye city. Apparently, all of these protests are connected to the cut-offs of electric power, which many people in these cities across Ukraine are finding unendurable. Their refrigerators aren't working. It's impossible to store food over long periods. And of course, there's growing worry about what will happen in the winter. And as I said, the protests do appear to be spreading. I'm not sure myself whether one should attribute any political importance to these protests so far. There's no cause, as far as I know, for an immediate end to the war. But anyway, protests are taking place. This has been happening alongside a drumbeat of rumours that I've been hearing for some months now, for 2 or 3 months, that some kind of anti-government partisan activity, as the Russians like to call it, has been spreading in some Ukrainian cities, that some Ukrainian citizens who are hostile to the current government and perhaps sympathetic to the Russians have started to carry out sabotage against Ukrainian military facilities. There's also reports that they've been providing intelligence to the Russians about Ukrainian troop movements, that sort of thing. Again, I find this all very difficult myself to assess, and I think it's dangerous to jump to any sort of conclusions about this. For one thing, most of these reports come from the Russians, and there's good reason to wonder whether the Russians themselves aren't greatly exaggerating the extent of all of this activity. I remember some months ago, I think it was about 2 months ago, I passed on and mentioned in one of my programs on this channel claims that were appearing on the official Russian news agency TASS that the Russians were being provided with information about Ukrainian troop dispositions in the town of Kherson, on the west bank of the Dnieper River, which of course the Russians withdrew from in the autumn of 2022. But anyway, these reports have been circulating and do appear. I suspect some kind of activity is taking place. A lot of the reports suggest that a major focus of this activity is the city of Odessa on the Black Sea coast in western Ukraine. And that is something which perhaps one might expect. Odessa is a city which has always had a reputation for being rebellious and difficult to control, and which has made little secret, as far as I can see, ever since the Maidan protests of 2014, of being deeply antagonistic and hostile to the authorities, the Maidan authorities in Kiev. Odessa not only did not participate in the Maidan protests in 2013-2014, but opposed them. And of course, as many people who follow these programs will know, in 2014, after the seizure of power in Kiev by the Maidan movement, major protests erupted in Odessa, and some of the protesters ended up in a trade union building there, and in extremely violent circumstances, the building itself caught fire, and many of the protesters were killed in the fire, and there's never been a proper investigation as to what happened, and certainly no accounting as to what happened, and apparently this episode remains a major issue for many people in Odessa. But again, let me stress, I'm not able to discuss in detail what is really going on, whether there really is this partisan activity that people are talking about, what connection, if any, it might have with these electricity protests. I think that this is impossible to assess with any accuracy at the moment. One thing that does point to something perhaps going on is that an important, or at least well-known to many people in Ukraine, but as of yesterday, not to me. One well-known activist, Ukrainian activist, or Maidan activist, Irina Faron, has just been shot dead in the western Ukrainian city, Lvov. Now, Faron, according to the various reports that I've seen, was somebody who was a former linguist, a major campaigner for the exclusive use of the Ukrainian language in Ukraine, a member of the Svoboda party, which is a party with a reputation for what some would say were far-right policies and political views. Some would say that it went even further than that. Anyway, Irina Faron has just been assassinated, shot dead in Lvov. Now, there's no word yet as to who might have been responsible. She's had arguments, quarrels with various members of the Ukrainian establishment in the past, who she obviously feels were not as staunch in their support of the Ukrainian language as she felt they should be. She's even criticized the Azov Brigade at times because some of its soldiers use Russian with each other. So maybe she was unpopular with those people. But anyway, there's no word yet as to who exactly was responsible for shooting her. Perhaps, conceivably, this is another example of this kind of partisan activity that we are hearing about, targeting of a senior Maidan activist. One possibility, of course, is that someone in Russia was behind it, and that this might have been some sort of retaliation for the various assassinations that have been conducted on Russian territory by the Ukrainian authorities, a fact which the Ukrainian authorities now no longer attempt to conceal. If it is that, then this is an ominous development indeed. But anyway, let's move on. Major events, therefore, in the area of Pokrovsk. Progres has fallen or is about to fall. Novoselivka Persha almost certainly has indeed fallen. The Russians in this area of the battlefront seem irresistible. The Ukrainian soldiers putting up weaker and weaker resistance, unable to hold back their positions. I understand that the village of Progres was actually fortified by the Ukrainians way back in 2014 during the political crisis that took place then. I understand that at that time it formed a part of what was called by the Ukrainian authorities the Poroshenko line, after the then president Petro Poroshenko. I presume this was done before June 2014, when the Ukrainian military began an offensive in Donbass, which aimed to subjugate the whole of Donbass and bring it back fully under the control of the Ukrainian government, the central Ukrainian government. Though that offensive ultimately was a catastrophic failure, it did recapture quite a lot of Donbass and presumably the village of Progres was one of the places at that time which the Ukrainian army was successfully able to recapture. And anyway, it was presumably at around that time that this village would have been fortified. Anyway, the loss of this village and of other places nearby, including Novoselivka Persha, means that the old Poroshenko line has now been broken. The Zelensky line, which was the line that the Ukrainians defended for well, several years, for 2 years, in fact, most of the fighting, further east in Donbass has, of course, already fallen. And the Russians are now within distance of attacking Pokrovsk itself. Elsewhere, as I said, in Torets, the Russians have captured this coal mine and this village. We've had less news about what's going on in Chasiv Yar, but it's likely that the Russians are continuing their advance there. And further north, in Kharkiv region, in Volchansk, the Chechen general, Abdi Alaudinov, tells us that the Russians have now captured a significant block of buildings within the area of the high-rise buildings that forms the citadel. That shows that the Ukrainians still have a presence in this area, but it appears that the Russians are continuing to make progress steadily in their attempt, their drive to capture Volchansk. So overall, a very, very bad military situation for the Ukrainians. And in the key area, the Pokrovsk area, now a critical one. Chasiv Yar, perhaps about to fall, at which point the situation in north-central Donbass will become critical as well. But following the fall of Avdiivka in February, the Russians, as I said, on a roll in central Donbass, enlarging continuously the hole that they've punched in the Ukrainian defense lines, working towards the eventual capture of the towns of Pokrovsk, Selidovo, and Kurakovo, breaking Ukrainian communications in this entire area, and triggering what I suspect will be the final crisis of the Ukrainian army seeking to defend Donbass. A couple of weeks ago, one of the many people who write to me, who've had a military background, suggested that the most sensible and logical thing for the Ukrainians to do was to beat a fighting retreat to the Dnieper, recognizing that eastern Ukraine is lost. The Ukrainians have not done that. They've attempted to defend all these positions well to the east of the Dnieper, and we're starting to see the results. The Ukrainian army has been hammered. Its ability to continue defending is weakening, and the pace of Russian advances is, as a result, accelerating. Well, that is the situation on the battlefronts. Now, today I'm going to discuss a little more detail some of the logistic issues, because there's been a very interesting series of articles, all of them, I should say, in the Western media, and I'm going to start with what I consider to be the most important one, which is in Reuters. And it's a huge article that's been published by Reuters, and it is specifically about US shell production. And of course, a short time ago, about a week ago, there was an article in Radio Liberty, on the website of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, which confirmed that production numbers for shell production in the EU had been greatly inflated. Instead of the EU producing 1.7 million shells by the end of this year, or reaching a production level of 1.7 million shells by the end of this year, the production level, the true production level that the EU is likely to achieve is around a third of that, between 500,000 to 600,000 shells a year. So this is an article which basically eviscerated many of the myths about shell production in the EU. Well, Reuters has now done the same about the United States. And it tells us that the situation with shell production in the United States used to be effectively catastrophic. It remains very bad. And it confirms that the current production number is around 36,000 shells a month, which is, of course, better than what the Europeans are achieving. But the article strongly suggests that expectations that shell production will increase by much more than this figure are very much open to doubt. So let's make a few quick observations. There's a very interesting and very useful graph which shows production rates of 155 millimeter shells in the United States over the last several years. And it turns out that in some years, in the mid 2010s, at a time when Barack Obama was president of the United States, in some years, production of 155 millimeter shells was so low at around 3,000 shells a month that in a number of years, the United States Army procured no 155 millimeter shells at all. Then, after 2016, something important happened. There was a small increase in shell production, almost insignificant increase in shell production in 2017, but then there was a jump in 2018, and shell production in that year increased to around 14,000, where it appears to have remained, 14,000 a month, where it appears to have remained up to the time of the start of Russia's special military operation. Now, Reuters, of course, does not tell us who the president was during this period when shell production grew, but of course the president was Donald Trump. And as is well known, Donald Trump did authorize a major increase in defense spending whilst he was president, and I suspect that some of that reached the shell production factories and is the single reason why there was this leap in shell production in 2018 over the insignificant levels which had existed before. Now, the interesting fact is that though there has been an increase in shell production since 2018, it is nowhere near as dramatic as the surge in shell production between 2016 and 2018. And, well, we've had reports that shell production on the eve of the start of the special military operation was around 14,155 millimeter shells a month. And we are told that it has since increased and that in 2024, that is to say this year, it has now reached a rate of around 36,000 shells a month. However, it is clear, at least to me, from reading this article, that this is a plateau, that it is going to be all but impossible to increase production using existing plants. And there's a list of some of the findings that have apparently been made by various researchers looking into the situation with shell production in the United States. And Reuters provides a series of points as to what they were. I'm going to read them. Production of 155 millimeter shells dropped so dramatically that from summer 2014 to autumn 2015, the United States added no new shells to its stockpile. Manufacturing defects and safety violations triggered repeated production line shutdowns. The 2021 discovery of cracks in shells cut production capacity in half for months. A US decision to change the type of explosive used in shells hasn't helped the war effort, that's the war effort in Ukraine, and to date has been an expensive flop. The army has spent $147 million on a facility it doesn't use. Now, the article goes into great detail about this. The usual explosive in shells is TNT, the explosive that I believe was invented at the end of the 19th century, perhaps by Alfred Nobel. I'm not going to guess. I'm not really an expert in explosives. Other people who follow these programs will be able to say. But anyway, the usual explosive for shells is TNT. The United States, alongside various other Western countries, decided that production of TNT was uneconomic and environmentally unfriendly. So the United States closed down all its factories that produced TNT, as, by the way, did the Europeans, so that in the entire collective West, there is apparently only one factory that still makes TNT, and that is in Western Poland. Apparently it was a factory originally built by the Germans to support their production, their shell production during the Second World War. And all TNT, apparently sourced by all Western countries for their shells, comes from this factory. The United States decided that this wasn't a good plan, and they decided some years ago, before the start of the special military operation, to build another plant that would produce a new type of explosive that would replace TNT in US shells. Now, it was not suggested that this explosive was more powerful than TNT, but it was apparently rather more stable, and producing it was more environmentally friendly. And a factory to produce this new explosive was built, except that it didn't manage to produce the explosives. Now, I have discussed in many programs that simply building a factory is not in itself sufficient to result in renewed production. You not only have to build the factory, you have to equip it with the necessary machine tools and other facilities. You have to train the workforce. It takes a long time to do this. You're starting on something completely new, an entirely new process involving new chemicals to build something to make something which no one has made before. Then the process can be protracted and can take a very long time. And today, in the United States and across the collective West, at a time when industrial skills have atrophied, and by the way, industrial management skills have atrophied also, this is a very demanding and challenging thing to do. And incidentally, the article has clarified something else, which is that though all of these factories, the factories that make the shells in the United States, the factory that was supposed to make this particular explosive, are state-owned, as one might expect of the United States, they are operated by private contractors who obviously have to make a profit on what they do. So these are not state-operated factories in a way that analogous factories in China and Russia would be. Something I didn't know, but which this article has revealed. So, simply building a new factory, simply coming to the decision that you can replace one form of explosive with another is going to take time. And the managers of this project don't seem to have understood this. The result was that the process of commissioning this factory and of starting production there took far longer than had been expected. The factory is now around 10 years behind production schedule, and the whole project for the moment has been frozen, with the US now returning to that factory in Poland to support its needs, to supply its needs for the old explosive, the old tried and tested explosive, which is TNT. Anyway, the article then goes on to speak of something else. It says a plan to replace an antiquated plant in Virginia that produced propellant, this is basically gunpowder, to launch the shells has fallen a decade behind its scheduled completion and has almost doubled in price. It's exactly the same point that I made before. You cannot simply start production by building a new factory. It requires a lot of preparation to do that. If you are working inside a well-run and strong industrial system with large reserves of skilled workers and engineers, and with an abundance of machine tools, that time frame can be reduced. But clearly that isn't the situation in the United States. And then we go on to read, that delay has created a greater reliance on raw materials from overseas than is publicly known. One internal US-American Army document from 2021 details foreign dependencies on at least a dozen chemicals made in China and India, countries with close ties to Russia. Now, again, the story is a fascinating one because, of course, making gunpowder, well, that's a well-established product for the chemical industry to make. It's obviously not been particularly lucrative. The United States ceased making gunpowder a long time ago, apparently, going back all the way to the 1980s. During the Reagan era, it hasn't made gunpowder since. And, well, this caused concern. So there was a decision made to build another plant to replace an existing one to make the gunpowder. But then the United States discovered that it doesn't actually produce the chemical components needed to make gunpowder. And it turns out that hardly anyone does in any quantity anywhere across the collective West. Apparently there are some plants that do so on a fragmentary basis in Germany, but they don't produce gunpowder on anything like the level, the quantities that would be needed in order to make, to produce the necessary amounts of gunpowder that are needed in order to actually fire the shells. To make it clear, gunpowder is needed to fire the shells, TNT is needed to provide the explosive charge, and the United States has serious problems producing both. And the article mentions that the two biggest producers of gunpowder are India and China. One presumes that it is from these countries that the United States has been importing both the gunpowder and perhaps the precursor chemicals. The article then goes on to admit that the Russians themselves do, however, have factories kept running since the Cold War where gunpowder is produced, so the Russians have no shortage of production of gunpowder. Well, all of this is set out in this article, There is no real explanation of how these problems are going to be overcome. There is a lot of discussion about the importance and the necessity of increasing the production rates. I've discussed previously how there is supposed to be a new factory which has been built which will ultimately provide the United States with produce another 30,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition to supplement the 36,000 rounds that the existing factories produce. But I've already said that looks to me a most ambitious target to get this factory producing that number of shells by the end of next year. We see from this article that when the United States has attempted in recent years to start production from fresh, start completely new production in new facilities, all kinds of problems have arisen and production has fallen repeatedly, far short of the intended targets. So I don't think, based on this article, that these production numbers that some people in the United States, in the Biden administration, have been coming up with, 80,000 shells a month by the end of next year, 100,000 shells by 2026, 2027, 100,000 shells a month by 2026, 2027. I don't think that that is going to be achieved. I think that these are wildly over-ambitious targets. I reckon that perhaps using every single expedient, relying heavily on this one single factory in Poland, which is now apparently working at the absolute limit of capacity. Something, by the way, which is dangerous in itself. It increases the risk of things going wrong in the production process. And remember, we are talking about producing TNT. So anyway, I'm not going to discuss that further. But anyway, I'm going to guess that if everything goes right, which is it may do, but then it might not, the United States might be producing between 50 and 60,000 rounds of 155 millimeter shells a month by the end of next year. Not the 80,000 they have been talking about, and far, far lower than the 100,000 a month that they've been talking about for 2027. And that will only be achieved if all of these immense bottlenecks are at least ameliorated, even if they cannot be solved entirely. And as I said, this article doesn't provide any clue or explanation about how that is to be done. The article contains a great deal of anecdotal information. It talks about how one particular official, increasingly worried about the state of the plants. This is actually before the special military operation began, toured various munitions plants, was shocked by the conditions he found, came across problems he found absurd. In Tennessee, he walked the floor of a new but idle $147 million factory built for use in the explosives process. The plant was literally gathering cobwebs. This is the plant that's supposed to be producing the new explosive that will replace TNT. In Pennsylvania, he toured a dilapidated shell casing factory, first used for the Korean War. It had been lightly used by the military for years in the mid-2010s and was now limping along with no significant upgrades funded. In Iowa, he was briefed on manufacturing flaws, including cracked 155mm shells that shut down one production line for months. And in Virginia, he visited a $399 million construction project running a decade behind schedule. This is the plant to produce the gunpowder, significantly over budget and still struggling to produce the propellant needed to launch the 155mm shells. That was, as I said, a few years ago. Probably the situation has improved then, but that gives us a sense of the incredibly intractable nature of the problem, and one which it is difficult to see how it can be sorted quickly, at least in anything like the timescale that has been talked about. And this article in Reuters sort of implicitly admits this, but it also acknowledges something else, something that had not been said in all of those months when the $61 billion appropriation by Congress was in limbo, for Ukraine was in limbo in Congress. The article admits that the problems for Ukraine, the extreme shell shortage which is faced by Ukraine, is primarily the product of this shell production crisis. It is not the problem. It is not a problem caused by the delay in producing, not a problem by the delay in getting that $61 billion funding package authorized. And, well, we read in the article that by the autumn of 2023, supplies of old Soviet 152mm shells had basically become exhausted in Ukraine, but that by that point, supplies of the Western 155mm shells were running low. By spring, there were times when a whole Ukrainian brigade had just 4 shells a day to cover at least a dozen kilometers of territory. And we are given some very interesting numbers, incidentally, about Ukrainian losses, which I found most intriguing. They say that the lack of shells is causing losses, heavy losses, on the part of Ukraine. And there's this article. A senior officer on Ukraine's general staff provided Reuters previously undisclosed figures that demonstrate the deadly difference artillery makes. When Ukraine was firing 10,000 shells per day, between 35 and 45 Ukrainian soldiers were killed daily, and about 250 to 300 were wounded. But when the daily fire fell to half that, that's to say 5,000 shells a day, more than 100 Ukrainian soldiers were killed per day, and at least 1,000 were wounded. Now note those figures. So this Ukrainian officer on the Ukrainian General Staff says that in the period, very brief period by the way, when Ukraine was able to fire 10,000 shells a day, basically for a short time in the summer, Ukrainian losses each day were 35 to 45 men killed and 250 to 300 wounded. But when the firing rate fell to 5,000 a day, the number spiked. 100 Ukrainian soldiers were killed each day, and 1,000 were wounded. So Ukrainian casualties spiked to 1,100 a day. 100 killed, 1,000 wounded, according to this officer in the Ukrainian General Staff. 1,100 men. Now, the current Ukrainian fire rate is said to be between 1 and 2,000 a day. So, if the Ukrainians were losing 1,100 men dead and wounded when they were firing 5,000 shells a day, given the correlation between losses and shells fired, one would expect Ukrainian losses, given the continued fall in the firing rate, to go up above 1,100. And that is exactly what the Russians are telling us is happening. The Russians, to repeat again, are saying that Ukraine every day now is losing between 1,500 and 2,000 men dead and wounded every day. That exactly matches what this Ukrainian officer is telling us, or at least told Reuters. So there we are. That's the situation on the battlefronts. The real situation on the battlefronts. Terrible losses by Ukraine every day, huge losses, partly caused by this catastrophic shell shortage. The figures Reuters has provided, surprisingly, match very closely the numbers the Russians themselves are giving us. It's likely that the Ukrainians now are losing several hundred men killed every day. They were losing 100 men killed every day when their firing rate was 5,000 rounds a day. It's now, as I said, significantly less than that. And it's likely that their casualty rates, their overall casualty rates, have spiked to roughly the figures that the Russians are giving us now. So, those who continue to deny the reality of the figures that the Russian Defense Ministry are providing perhaps need to look carefully at the information being provided by the Ukrainians themselves to Reuters. Just saying. So there we go. A fundamental industrial crisis, shell production in Europe far below the levels that were expected and by the European Commission. The Europeans producing perhaps 500,000 to 600,000 shells a year. The United States at the moment producing perhaps even less than that. Logistical bottlenecks that no one knows how to resolve or sort out. Spiking Ukrainian casualty numbers. And the article straightforwardly acknowledges that the Russians, for their part, seem to be suffering no obvious shortages in the numbers of shells they fire at the Ukrainians. They're at least 5 times more than the numbers that the Ukrainians are able to fire back at them. Now, perhaps because we've had these articles that have appeared in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, discussing Ukrainian Ukrainian shortages of Ukrainian material, and the inability, and this article in Reuters, and the inability of the West to keep Ukraine supplied with the shells it needs. We've had a predictable swathe of articles from appearing in parts of the media, especially The Economist, telling us, reviving that old story about how the Russians supposedly are on the verge of running out of equipment. And The Economist focuses in on tanks and armored vehicles. It says that the stockpiles of Soviet-era tanks and armored vehicles, which the Russians have been busy refurbishing and sending into the battle, are now almost exhausted. That the Russians, when they claim that they make 1,200 tanks a year, what they're really doing is simply refurbishing old tanks. The numbers of new tanks, T-90Ms, is very small, and that the huge stockpiles of old tanks bequeathed by the Soviet Union have been almost run down, and that before long the Russians will face a crisis because they won't have enough tanks and armored vehicles to sustain the offensive. I'm going to say straight away that I think these articles have appeared in response to these articles about shell production, these admissions about the true state of shell production in the West that we've just had from, as I said, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty with respect to the Europeans, and from Reuters with respect to the United States about shells. And by the way, the same article in The Economist talked about the Russians running out of gun barrels. Apparently, their artillery is in a grave situation because the Russians aren't able to replace the barrels of their guns, which are beginning to fray and deteriorate given the constant firing. Now, I read this article in The Economist, and the thing that immediately struck me is that this was based on no actual information. The articles in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the article in Reuters about shell production in the United States, these articles are based on actual factual information, actual reporting. The Economist article is based purely on surmise. It takes claims about the numbers of Russian tanks and armored vehicles that have been destroyed, claims provided by the Ukrainians and by the Oryx project in the Netherlands at face value. It looks at figures for the numbers of tanks and armored vehicles and that are supposed to be held by Russia in stockpiles. It takes those figures as face value. Also, it is aware of the existence of one Austrian forging machine for renovating barrels and making barrels in one factory. It assumes that that is the only Austrian forging machine that the Russians possess. It doesn't address the possibility that the Russians might be making forging machines of their own. After all, this is apparently a forging machine that has been in production in Austria since possibly the 1950s, certainly in the 1960s. Simplicius the Thinker has a long piece about how the CIA plotted mass purchases by the old Soviet Union of these forging machines from Austria. So could be, as Simplicius the Thinker speculates, that the Russians actually have many more of them, But of course, it's also plausible and likely that they will have built some of their own. We're not talking about a new cutting edge technology here. But anyway, it looks at all of this, speculates on these rather tenuous assumptions, and comes to the conclusion that sometime in the summer the Russians are going to run out of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers. It completely ignores the statements made by the Russian Defense Ministry and by Russian officials, such as Chemezov, who is in charge of Rostek, the big Russian conglomerate, military-industrial conglomerate, state-owned, which is, of course, essentially the Russian military-industrial complex. It discounts Chemezov's comments. It discounts comments made by Sergei Shoigu, the former Russian defense minister, about the huge increase in production volumes of shells, artillery, all of those things, barrels, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and all of the rest. It disregards all of those, and it speculates, based on its various set of assumptions, that the Russians are going to run out of tanks and armoured vehicles sometime in the summer, and at that point their offensive, their ongoing offensive, which has brought the Russians now to the gates of Pokrovsk and before long Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, at that point it's going to run out of steam. Well, I have to say, I think that these assumptions, first of all, we need to recognise that they are assumptions. And secondly, based on the information the Russians themselves have been giving us and their own actions, I think that there is no basis to them. The Russians have been highlighting, showing us more and more new tanks and artillery pieces that they've been sending into the battlefronts. Recently, they showed us new Malva artillery pieces, for example, that have entered into the battlefronts. They have also shown us, they've also told us that their new Koalitsiya self-propelled guns have also entered the battlefronts. They also clearly are drawing on their stockpiles. So recently, the Russians have also shown old M46 130mm guns also being pressed into action and brought back into the battle. But if the Russians really were short of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured vehicles, as The Economist is saying, I would have thought that already they would be taking steps to husband their use of these things, and there is no sign of that. On the contrary, as we see, the Russians have been intensifying their offensive over the last few months. I get no sense of any concern on the Russian side that they're about to run out of the equipment, the essential equipment that The Economist says they will. And on the topic of tanks specifically, Simplikis the Thinker, in a recent piece, which successfully, I think, debunks a lot of these claims that have been appearing in places like The Economist. Anyway, he makes the entirely valid point that over the last couple of months, numbers of Russian tanks, which can be verified as having been hit, have dwindled to very low levels. Just as, by the way, simultaneously, reports from the Mediazona project of actual reported Russian fatalities have dwindled too. So, that again seems to call into question the claims that the Russians are running out of machines. Anyway, I would point out, by the way, in addition, that not every tank that we see hit by an FPV drone is knocked out, and far from every tank that we see on the battlefield that's lying around damaged is beyond repair. I'm going to guess that only a fraction of the Russian tanks that we see hit and damaged and lying idle on the battlefronts is beyond repair. And with the Russians advancing rather than retreating, most of their tanks which are hit will remain under their control. They can be retrieved and taken back to the rear and can be refurbished there, and they can be brought back into the battle. And I'm sure an awful lot of that is going on. My sense is, as I said, that the Russians are not short of tanks and other machines. In fact, they have been expanding the size of their armed forces. And would they really be doing that? Would they realistically be doing something like that if they were, in fact, running short of tanks and machines, and if they couldn't replace the barrels of their guns? Anyway, let's also consider briefly the fact that this article in The Economist doesn't touch on the other major change that we have seen on the battlefronts over the last few months. The Russian Air Force has now been very busy, as we know. There's a whole cascade of films that have appeared, provided by the Russian Defense Ministry, showing the Russian Air Force dropping their guided bombs, their FAB and ODAB and RBK and whatever it is, guided bombs, which have had such a devastating impact on the battlefronts. And it's important to remember that there appears to be no shortage at all of these types of bombs. In fact, Russian reserves here appear to be all but limitless. On the topic of the Russian Air Force and its operations, there is a very, very interesting account, and I believe partly a film, though I haven't seen the film, which provides some clarity about those reports which I discussed a short time ago, of the Russians being able to shoot down Patriot missiles, air defense missiles, launched by the Ukrainians after launch. And they describe a rather interesting scenario, one where a Sukhoi 34 carrying out a strike mission on Ukraine realized that it had been detected by a Patriot radar system and would become a target. It turns out that the Sukhoi 34 was covered by other Russian fighters. The fighters and their radars were able to detect the Patriot missiles that were being launched at this Sukhoi 34 and were able to shoot those missiles down using air-to-air missiles. An interesting discussion. And it threw in the fact that the Sukhoi 34 itself also detected another air defense battery. I can't remember whether it was an NASAMS or an IRIS-T or whatever it was, and was able to destroy it itself. So the Russians have provided an explanation of how they are currently able to shoot down Patriot air defense missiles. I didn't know that it could be done. I haven't seen any discussion about this in any other platform or program, but that article apparently, and that film apparently does come from the Russian Defense Ministry itself, and it shows that the Russians are doing that. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that despite the painstaking attempts to reassure us that the Ukrainians are only going to have to deal with this Russian offensive for a few more weeks, because by the end of the summer, the Russians will have run out of tanks and armoured vehicles and will have to scale down their offensive or end it completely. The reality is that the Ukrainians are becoming increasingly outmatched on the battlefronts, that the Russians are increasing their strike forces, they've got their aircraft operating, they're shelling the Ukrainians relentlessly, and the Ukrainians are not going to get the additional supplies of shells that they need. And the article from Reuters, without, of course, intending to, has provided strong corroboration for the Russian Defense Ministry's claims about Ukrainian losses. Bear in mind that the Ukrainian officer spoke about 100 Ukrainian soldiers killed a day, when the Ukrainian firing rate for shells was 5,000 a day. 100 a day translates to 700 killed a week. It is now likely that more than 1,000, significantly more than 1,000 Ukrainian troops are being killed on the battlefronts every week, probably significantly more than that. Anyway, let's now move on and discuss some of the political developments which, of course, are going to affect the whole direction of the war. Yesterday in my programme, I said that I could smell a plot, that it was far from clear to me that Joe Biden had indeed agreed to step down as the Democratic Party's candidate for the for the presidential election in November, and so it is proved. Yesterday, comments started to appear from his campaign, originating with him, that he remains determined to continue as the Democratic Party's candidate, that he's anxious to take on Donald Trump. And there's been articles which have appeared in the New York Times talking about how he is stewing in Delaware, furious apparently with all of the leaders of the Democratic Party who are trying to get him to stand down, particularly angry with Barack Obama, who he apparently believes is the major orchestrator of this campaign to get him to stand down, in which, by the way, he is probably true. But anyway, it is clear that the old man is, for the moment, still determined to carry on. He might not be able to. Now, I've received a cluster of emails from people explaining how it works, how the donors really are able to prevent funding of the campaign. And I would have thought, if that is indeed going on, if they have indeed managed to freeze the funds, then that is terminal. Even Biden must know that he can't win an election campaign in the United States without money. I mean, that just doesn't happen in the United States. So it seems that the funders might indeed be able to put on that kind of pressure. And with every day that passes, sometimes even with every hour that passes, some other prominent Democrat comes forward and basically is advising Biden to reconsider his position. At some point, the old man, I expect, will crack, though for the moment he is not doing so, and he's becoming increasingly angry and resentful of his party for putting him under all of that pressure. It also seems to be the case that he's furious with Kamala Harris, who he presumably sees as disloyal. He's apparently not going to endorse her. If he is forced to stand down as the party's nominee and she takes over, he's not going to openly endorse her, and he intends to remain president of the United States, even if he is forced to end his campaign. Now, I'm not going to discuss the electoral effects of all of this, which briefly I think would be disastrous for the Democrats if Biden really did behave in this way. All I would say is that it increases enormously the geopolitical dangers, because a Biden still in the White House, still president, but conscious that his legacy, such as it is draining away, is going to be even less inhibited about doing things which he should not be doing than a Biden who is hoping to be re-elected in November. And I, for one, can very easily see how in this kind of situation, Biden, who has very strong visceral feelings about Donald Trump, about Vladimir Putin, about China, about all sorts of other things, might decide that this is the moment for him to go for broke. He's got nothing to lose. He's not going to be re-elected in November. So why not go for broke? Why not win this great battle over the Russians or the Chinese? And if things go wrong, if risks ensue, well, so be it. Biden himself is not seeking re-election. And if it's Kamala Harris and the Democrats who pay the price in November, well, Biden probably will say to himself, well, serves them right. So this is, it seems to me, an extremely dangerous moment indeed, very fraught moment indeed. And anybody should be extremely worried about what it is that Biden might now choose to do. Now, for the rest, it's important to say that if Biden does decide to go for broke, he will have supporters. There have been two really extraordinary articles which have appeared in the British media over the last 24 hours, and each of them, in its own way, I think reflects closely neocon thinking in the United States, as well as in Britain itself. One is an article that has appeared in the Daily Telegraph, and it's been written by Charles Moore, who is one of the Daily Telegraph's former editors. He continues to hold, to wield great influence there, and he is extremely unhappy about the fact that Donald Trump has selected J.D. Vance as his potential vice president. And, well, the article by Charles Moore, which, as I said, I think reflects neocon thinking very closely, makes comments like this: there is the fate of the entire world to consider. One of Mr. Trump's clearest messages, amplified by his choice of J.D. Vance, is that he does not want to help Ukraine defeat Vladimir Putin's invasion. His strategic realism, and the word realism is in quotation marks, advanced by policy advisors such as Elbridge Colby. Remember, he wrote that article in the Financial Times that I spoke about at the time, saying that the United States had to make a choice between China and Russia, and China was the more serious threat. There is some word now that if the Trump-Vance team is elected in November, Elbridge Colby will become the new Secretary of State. Just saying. Anyway, his strategic realism, advanced by policy advisors such as Elbridge Colby, looks at these issues through the lens of pragmatism, and again those words are in quotation marks, and decides that America cannot deal with the Russia and China problems at the same time. Since the United States and China are the two heavyweight boxers, that is where all the action should be, they say. If this were just a military division of labour argument, it would make some sense. Mr. Trump has always been right that America cannot help defend Europe if Europe will not defend itself. But he goes much further than this. He seems not to accept that China and Russia see very clearly the link between grabbing Taiwan and grabbing Ukraine and wish to use it to break Western, especially American power. His faith in the capacity of one telephone call made by him to calm it all down is astonishing. Despite his pugnacious character, Trump's role model seems to be Neville Chamberlain, not Winston Churchill. Trump's neo-isolationism thinks as if the Second World War had never happened. Even then, an era of much slower communications and far fewer human and commercial links than today, the Western Allies recognized that it was impossible to see the war in Europe and the war in the Far East as separate entities except in operational terms. The threat was global. Victory had to be global too. Can I, before I proceed, say that I am absolutely exhausted. I am, in fact, sick and tired of this constant conjuring of the events of the Second World War and this constant rehashing of these phrases, appeasement and isolationism. Appeasement is now dragged out as a blanket term to criticize anybody who believes in diplomacy, even though diplomacy is an essential part of statecraft, and isolationism seems to be another blanket term that is used to abuse anybody in the United States specifically who thinks that the United States should at this time seek to pursue a policy of peace. But anyway, with all of that, and with my similar exhaustion at the constant reconjuring of the ghosts of Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill, let me immediately point to the obvious flaw of this whole argument. The situation in the world today is completely different from the situation in the world in the 1940s. In the 1940s, the United States had a manufacturing industry which was greater than that of all of the rest of the world combined. It far exceeded the manufacturing and industrial and raw material resources available to the Axis of Germany, Japan, and, well, Italy was also one of their allies. Today, the situation is reversed. It is China, not the United States, which is the world's greatest manufacturing power. And if the war in Ukraine has demonstrated any single thing, it is that the United States does not have the manufacturing prowess any longer to face down China and Russia in combination, even indeed as it is struggling to match down the weaker of these two powers, which is Russia alone. Charles Moore seems to assume infinite American resources. He reduces everything to a question of will. Those resources, those infinite resources which he imagines, do not exist. Going back to the points that I made earlier in this program, we have a situation where a top executive is going around American munitions plants. He finds one filled with cobwebs. It's never produced anything. He finds another where the production process is chaotic and disorganized. I've discussed at length the immense difficulties and supply bottlenecks that are affecting US production of shells, and these are the problems that any rational statesman today in the United States must face. One of the fundamental problems with all of the neocons, every one of them, including, of course, Charles Moore in this particular case, is that they use this emotional language. They trot out words like appeasement and isolationism and all of that without addressing the fact that resources now are finite and becoming more so, and that the West and the United States, in industrial terms, are outmatched. Now, that is not a reason for despair. As I said many times, despair is a bad counselor. The Russians and the Chinese may be very powerful, but they're not so powerful that they can simply overrun the rest. And it doesn't seem as if their very rational leaders have any plan to do so. What it does mean is that a realist leader in the United States must turn to diplomacy and must also engage in priorities, must sort out priorities. Well, if Charles Moore's article is completely detached from reality, it doesn't come close to the problems that the other article by Timothy Snyder, a professor of history that I believe Yale University has penned for the Financial Times. I have to say that I found this one of the most astonishing articles that I've ever read in the Financial Times, and that is saying something. And look at what it says about Donald Trump. Republicans reminded us of the alternatives to republics, hosting a convention that showed how the American one could be brought down. They summoned up three variants of collapse: tyranny, oligarchy, and anarchy. And then we have a long piece telling us about how Donald Trump is a would-be tyrant, that he's transformed the Republican Party into a cult of personality, that he's a convicted criminal running for office, that this undoes the expectation of any rule of law. We're told that he promises mass deportations, detention camps, military tribunals, actions that would change the American regime type. Things, by the way, which already happen in the United States, but never mind. Then he talks about the oligarchs that stand behind him, and he has a whole list of them. And they include people like, yes, the most important is Vladimir Putin, whose propagandists adore Trump and celebrate Vance. So Putin, amongst everything else, is an American oligarch as well, so it would seem. But look how Snyder then goes on to bracket him. He brackets him with David Sachs, a Silicon Valley investor, Elon Musk, and Peter Thiel. Elon Musk, by the way, just to point out, is one of the few successful industrialists that the United States can point to. I know there are some people on this program who take issue with electric cars, but put that aside and consider the immense organizational and management skill with which Elon Musk has built up his company, Tesla, and has managed his various space-related programs. Who else in the United States possesses that? We've just discussed a whole article about factories unable to produce anything and filled with cobwebs. So anyway, for the record, I've attended programs with David Sachs. He's been a guest on our shows for the Duran. I liked him. I found him level-headed and rational and sane. I object strongly to this description of him as some kind of oligarch. And Peter Thiel, I don't know. But anyway, pressing on, why would all of these people back this tyrant who is Donald Trump? Well, it's because their platform is anarchy. There is a general rather than personal explanation for their support for a peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine with its implicit territorial reward for Russian aggression. It is likely the desire to bring down order, to create international chaos. And of course, we're then told that the reason that the oligarchs want chaos is that they favour anarchy at home. Only the state can collect taxes, so making it dysfunctional serves an interest in maximising wealth. This is nonsense. The people who are most concerned about orderly government, about efficient government, are business people in any society. In the case of Elon Musk, he has factories to run. That requires workers, that requires infrastructure, that requires stable supply chains. He absolutely will not want a situation of anarchy to arise in the United States. The whole notion is an absurd one. David Sachs is an investor. He will want returns on his investments, the funds that he is investing in, the businesses that he is investing in. They will also need to have stability, some degree of stability, function in a system of order in order to make returns. And, well, I don't know so much about Peter Thiel, so I'm not going to discuss him. But anyway, all of this astonishing farrago of nonsense, what it all leads up to, however, is essentially in the end the same thing as what Charles Moore is advocating. Unlimited, unending support for Ukraine. Timothy Snyder shows no more interest or understanding about the fact that resources are finite than Charles Moore does. In fact, he never discusses resources. He seems to assume that all the United States has to do is press the button and the resources will appear. And, well, if they don't, he can always hide behind what The Economist is saying, which is that the Russians, having previously supposedly been about to run out of missiles and run out of aircraft and helicopters and jet engines and all of those things. Well, now they're about to run out of artillery barrels and infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. When we read comments like this, and note that Charles Moore's piece has been published in the Daily Telegraph, Timothy Snyder's piece has been published in the Financial Times, you find very similar pieces being written in all sorts of other places. You could see that if President Biden does decide to go for broke in Ukraine or somewhere else over the next few months, he will not lack for prominent supporters. As I said, I think that this is in some respects a particularly dangerous moment. Marco Rubio, US Senator, Republican, some had thought that he might be Donald Trump's choice for vice president. Thankfully, at least I think thankfully, that has not happened. He's made the absolutely obvious point that if Biden is unfit to be the candidate for the presidency, then he is also unfit to be president as well. That, it seems to me, is obvious. And if Biden does finally agree to stand down as nominee, as the party's nominee, the Democratic Party's nominee, as candidate for the presidency of the United States, then it is incumbent upon the Democratic Party to ensure that he stands down as president as well. That will mean that we will have President Kamala Harris to deal with, which will no doubt present us with a whole new set of problems, but they will not be as serious either for the party electorally or for the world generally as keeping this angry old man, in that case, in the White House. Anyway, that is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to check out our shop, where you can find all the amazing things that we have there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts and all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.